Good evening. My name is David Strittmatter, Assistant Professor of History at Ohio Northern University. Today is December 19th, 2022, conducting a Zoom interview with a guest tonight, and I'll let him introduce himself. So what is your name and where are you from?
I'm Stephen Gagnon. I'm from Fort Myers, Florida.
And where are you from originally?
Worcester, Ohio.
And I'm interviewing you today because you served in the Ohio National Guard. When did your enlistment begin?
March of 1969.
And why did you join the National Guard?
Well, I began as an infantryman, but then I went on to OCS and became an officer.
So how long in total did you serve in the Guard?
About 6.5 years. I got out in July of 1970. No, 1975, excuse me. So
what was your initial motivation for joining?
Didn't want to go to Vietnam. Being honest.
What were your duties? What sorts of things did you do in the Guard?
I began as an infantryman, and then I went on to OCS, became an officer. So I was a platoon sergeant, platoon leader in an infantry company, and from there I became went on to headquarters company. And when we switched from being infantry to being armored cav, I was the XO in the artillery battery.
And how do you remember your time in the Guard?
It was duty. It was whenever I would be done with our drill, the first thing, if I was going to stop any place on the way home, I changed my clothes, so I didn't go any place in my uniform. I wasn't proud to be wearing my uniform. Let me say it that way.
Why not?
Well, when I came home from OCS and I walked off the plane, I was spit on by a young lady because I was a military person walking off the plane. A couple months later, I was going to a drive-in after drill to get some food because my wife worked second shift. So I thought, well, I'll get some dinner on the way home. And I was refused service at this drive-in restaurant. They didn't tell me that until I sat there for a half an hour and watched other people come and go and get their food and leave and so forth. And finally, I asked the young lady where my food was, and they had taken my order. And she said, "Oh, I forgot to tell you, we don't serve green pigs." And that's the last time I went there for food. But that taught me that I shouldn't be wearing my uniform after drill because it wasn't respected or anything. I never felt respected in my uniform.
How did you respond in either of those two cases?
I just quietly walked away. Me responding to that was like, it was pointless for me to react to them. They had their opinions,
Can you describe your everyday life during your Guard years outside of National Guard duty?
Oh yes, I worked maintenance at a factory called Akron Brass, and we affectionately called our job everything that nobody else wanted to do, but we we did everything. We did the welding, pipe fitting, machine repairs. All that was in our bag of shit. We did electrical. All of that was what we did. It was a great experience for me. I learned a lot about engineering by working maintenance. And that taught me that I wanted to go back into college and get my engineering degree, which is what I did.
So during your years in the Guard, what were some of the reasons that your Guard unit was called out?
I wasn't with the Guard unit when they were called out. If you're referring to Kent State,
or
I was not there.
Any sorts of actions.
Well, the only course of action I was called out on was a trucker strike, which was in, I believe, 1974 or 1975, something like that. And we did 2 weeks of duty in beautiful downtown Painesville, Ohio, guarding bridges for on Interstate 90, so that people wouldn't throw bowling balls and rocks off of trucks, off of the bridges at the truckers. So I ran the third shift for the company at the time. So it was kind of fun, but it was cold, but it was fun. We got 4 to 6 inches of snow every day. So yeah.
Well, Mr. Gagnon, I found your name in a New York Times article it ran in June of 1970. And so this was about a month and a half after the Kent State shootings. Now, there was a reporter that was asking Guardsmen at the drill in Camp Perry kind of about their viewpoints of this occurrence. But you were not at Kent State a month and a half prior. You're quoted, but do you have any memories of that specific drill? It would have been the first drill after the events at Kent State.
That was a whirlwind. I came back from Kent State was on May 4th. I came back from OCS on May 12th, which is when I got home from Fort Benning, Georgia. And within 2 weeks after doing that, we went to Camp Perry for range firing. And then about 2 weeks after that, we went to Grayling, Michigan for our summer camp. So it was all bam, 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 things happening real fast. So I'm the new kid on the block trying to learn, what I'm supposed to be doing and so forth. And I remember the reporter asking me questions, but I couldn't give him any very good answers. I wasn't at Kent State, so I couldn't really give him any answers what he was looking for. I was just a new second lieutenant at that time.
The article mentioned new officer Lieutenant Stephen Gagnon had gone to Kent before leaving to attend officer candidate school, and your quote in this article was, quote, "I'm not sure I'm going back." Can you fill in the details on this?
No, I can't recall that, tell you the truth.
But so you attended Kent though?
Oh yes. Oh, I did not go back to Kent. I went to the University of Akron. And the reason I went to the University of Akron, I lived in Worcester, and about 15 miles from where I lived was Orrville, Ohio, and there was a branch of it had been a branch of Kent State University, but in the time I had joined the Army and gone away for OCS and so forth, that had transitioned from a Kent State University branch to a University of Akron branch, and that's how I wound up going to the University of Akron. I began back at the community college level in Orrville. So, but it was 12 years of night school for me to get my bachelor's degree, doing that because I was working 10 to 12-hour days. I was also building my house at the time. And so I was either working or sleeping. It didn't matter if I was working on my house, working at work, or working at school. I was working all that time. So, yes.
So you were not at Kent State when that tragedy occurred. So where was officer candidate school, and do you have any memories of that news breaking?
Oh yes, it was in Fort Benning, Georgia, and when it happened, we were in formation, and our TAC officer came out and said, "Everybody from Ohio, raise your hand." And there was 4 or 5 of us that were from Ohio, and they said, "Well, you've all been, you'll be activated when you get home. There's been a shooting at Kent State University, and your units were involved." And that's how I was told about it.
Do you recall any of the reactions of your fellow OCS, the other candidates in training there?
We had no reaction. We didn't have time for reactions. We were, if you wouldn't have a reaction like that, you were going to do push-ups. So no, there was no reactions.
Do you
we
think...
couldn't believe it? We were talking about it later on in the evening. We couldn't believe it. We could not believe it But at the time when they told us about that, we couldn't react to it.
So
So that was part of the discipline at the time.
So then you that evening you spoke with the other Ohio members down there in Fort Benning?
Yes, there was 2 or 3 other guys from Ohio that were with me, and we talked about it, and basically we couldn't believe it, but the newspapers had the headlines telling us that's what was going on. So obviously that was the truth. So I didn't find out anything more about it until I got back from OCS on May 12th.
What do you recall about the media coverage of the shootings?
I would say it was very, very negative about the National Guard. But then when I got home and I was talking to my platoon sergeant and the members of my platoon who were there, and had discussions with them, they had told me how they had a steel pot was for their protection. That's all they had for personal protection was a steel pot. Today, when you see people going into a riot, they've got shields, they've got face shields, they've got all kinds of personal protection for the policemen or reservists or our National Guardsmen going in. We had no such thing at the time, and students were pelting bricks. One of my sergeants told me that there was 2 truckloads of bricks that were delivered near the community center or something to for a building that was being under construction. And after the 3 or 4 days of the riot, all of those bricks were gone from that construction site, and they had been thrown at the guardsmen. And a lot of my guardsmen had injuries. Several of them didn't make it to summer camp because they had injuries from the May 4th incident, or leading up to the May 4th incident. So, yeah, it was not a very kind environment to be in.
How closely did you follow the investigation in the trials that followed?
I heard it on the news, and that's all I did to follow it. I couldn't do anything to affect it or change it. So, I mean, I just followed what was on the news. And I found it interesting that the state of Ohio didn't allow themselves to be sued. And one of the gentlemen who was my squad leader when I became when I enlisted, he wound up committing suicide. He was one of the people that was on the hill. He had a weapon that had been discharged, and I don't know if somebody had been hurt or injured or killed or whatever from his weapon being discharged. But he was sued civilly, and he lost his business, he lost his marriage, he lost his home, and after a year or 2 of that treatment, he used a shotgun and stopped it all by killing himself. So that was tragic. And then after he died, the state of Ohio would allow themselves to be sued, and there was a court trial after that. Okay. But prior to that, they wouldn't answer his phone calls. If they answered his phone calls, they were giving him legal advice, and they couldn't give him any legal advice, or they would be sued. The state was able to be sued if they had given him any legal advice whatsoever. So they never answered his phone calls. They never talked to him. He was ostracated, completely isolated by himself to handle the whole situation. And it wasn't a good thing for him. It didn't wind up being very good anyhow. He was dead. And I can't remember his name, so I can't tell you that.
Well, the Kent State shootings occurred relatively early during your 6 years in the Guard.
Oh, yes.
6.5 years in the Guard. And so though you were not there, how do you think the shadow of that event affected your time, in the Guard for the next 5 years?
Oh, I was never proud to be wearing my uniform. I did my duty. I wore my uniform. I did my duty at that and so forth. But as soon as I could get my uniform off, I got it off. I was never proud to be wearing my uniform. It was it wasn't in civilian circles. you weren't a Guardsman. You didn't want to be a Guardsman because you would just be ostracized. The people I worked with knew I was a Guardsman and so forth, but we never talked about it.
Do you think those feelings would be different if Kent State had not happened?
Oh yes, I think so. Yes. In fact, today, let me see. A couple years ago, I joined a American Legion, and they were all, thank you for your service, come and join, and so forth. And it's like all of a sudden in the last 5-10 years, I get a lot of thank you for your service, but I never really felt like I provided a good service to the country because I never had a good experience out of it.
And do you think that has generated some resentment from you?
I can't say resentment. It's just like, well, okay, thank you. Everybody thanks me for my service today, and I consider it too much, too little, too late. I'm an old man now. You're going to thank me for my service. You didn't do that when I was 40. So, no, I don't. I think it's too much, too little, too late. That didn't come about until after Desert Storm, when everybody started feeling good about the military again. So,
Do you think that the narrative of the Kent State shootings has been fair to the Ohio National Guard?
no way whatsoever. It was all slanted towards the students. So no one ever gave any thought whatsoever to what the Guardsmen were going through. You were okay. The Guardsmen were doing duties at night, and so out of the dark, a brick would come flying at you, and you never saw it coming, and you couldn't duck or see anything with that. It's just bam, here's a brick in your face, and that's the way they were treated. And it wasn't, the pictures and everything in the news showed them on guard duty during the day with lines trying to manage the rioters and so forth, but they were trying to manage the rioters at night also, and at night they were totally unprotected, and you never saw that on the news or anything, and no one ever talked about that. And they weren't in lines at night or anything like that, but they had guards posted different places, and so you'd be on guard duty and have a brick thrown at you. So the people took pot shots at them all the time. That was never covered by the news press.
In the past couple of years, there have been episodes of violent protest in America. A couple examples in the summer of 2020, after the death of George Floyd, in January, a couple years ago at the U.S. Capitol building. What parallels do you see between those instances and what the Guard was dealing with in the Vietnam War era?
Well, the mentality of a crowd, there's no reasoning to what a crowd's going to do. The mentality of a crowd in a riot, they go with the flow, and reasonable people will do unreasonable things when they're in a riot situation. If the people you're around are looting something, you're more apt to be swept up into that and doing looting. If you're destroying a police vehicle, you'll be swept up into that and help destroy the police vehicle. There's not much thinking that people do when they're in a crowd. They just follow the will of the crowd, if you will, and that's still a common thread. That was going on at Kent State, and that still goes on today. When you have a crowd associated with a riot or whatever, I see that routinely. In with the George Floyd thing, they were protesting, and destroying everything in the world. And there wasn't any reason for that. Like, why are you destroying everything that's in your neighborhood because the cops did this? There's no reasoning behind that. So, I mean, people have a right to protest and so forth. I have nothing wrong with that. But the destruction that they go through in a whole neighborhood, killing out a lot of people today have no grocery store where they live because it was destroyed in a riot. And the people that own that grocery store said, I'm not going to replace it. And so now these people have to leave their homes and travel miles to get groceries. They live in a desert area for groceries, if you will, because of the results of the riot. And people don't, you never hear about that today either. But, you know, that's just, that's the mindset of a riot, and that's how it works out. That hasn't changed. In 50 years, that hasn't changed.
Is there a lesson to be learned from the Kent State tragedy?
I can't say for that. That was a time when, you know, the people were protesting the Vietnam War and sending our troops into Laos and Cambodia, which was an expansion of the war, and people didn't want the war anyhow, and they were trying to contain it as much as possible. The expansion of the war into Cambodia and Laos, it didn't happen at that time. It happened way before then, but then the news finally broke that they were doing that. Since I've been out of the Army, I've met other people that were in the Army, and I've met people that were doing LRP, long-range patrols, in Vietnam, and they had done long-range patrols into Cambodia and Laos and alongside the Ho Chi Minh Trail and so forth. And they were out of the military before I got in. So that had all happened way before, but the news finally got a hold of that. And yeah, you have to understand, the first casualty of any war is the truth. When we had Desert Storm, we had all kinds of deception on how we were going to invade Iraq, and that's not what happened. The invasion came a completely different direction from what the Iraqis were prepared to have us defend us from, and that's what you do in war. So, yeah.
Mr. Gagnon, why did you agree to have this to sit for this interview for my project?
Oh, it took us a while to get here, didn't it? It was mostly due to my schedule. I'm a flight instructor. I'm very busy doing that today, and other than that, I try to get some fishing done in Florida here. But no, I figured I talked to my daughter. She works in public relations, and she said, "Go ahead and tell your story." So that's what I'm doing. You asked me for my story. I'm telling you my story. It's not much of a story, but yeah, that's what it is. My time in the Guard, I was working, and when I wasn't working, I was sleeping. So I had worked very hard during that time. I don't regret it, and it helped me get to where I'm at in my life today. If I hadn't put in the hard time when I could afford to do that because I was strong at the time, stronger than I am today, I wouldn't be where I'm at. So I don't regret it.
Is there any question that I haven't asked you that maybe I should?
No, that's about it. So I'm not apologetic about my time in the Guard. I'm not apologetic the way I felt about the Guard. The Guard today is much more admired in their communities than they were when I was in the Guard. And I kind of envy that. But hey, that was then, this is now. That's the way it goes.
Well, thank you very much.
My pleasure, sir.
For speaking with me. and for telling your story. It's very much appreciated.
Yep. You have a great day.